So good morning, everyone. And of course, thanks to Prof for inviting Johnson and myself to talk a little bit about this study that we did. I think all of you know about mindfulness and are very aware of the benefits of mindfulness practice. This particular study was important because rather than looking at just people who were aging normally, the focus was on people who already had some form of mild cognitive impairment. So that was the significance of this study. Very different from other research that has been done to date, which has looked at normally aging adults or young adults or older adults. All right. So mindfulness, as we know, modulates inflammation. It also affects or reduces stress-related pathways, and it has a big impact on the neuroplasticity of the brain. So in our study, we decided to be very comprehensive in looking at the effects of mindfulness practice. We looked at the connections in the brain, and this is what Dr. Pham will be talking about a little later. We also looked at neuropsychological tests to see whether with mindfulness practice there could be improvement in changes. And we did a whole lot of biological markers as well to see if there's any reduction in inflammation and so on. All right. So today, my presentation will focus on telomere lengths and on the different biological markers that we tested. For information, this study was done over 9 months. In the first 3 months, the intervention was provided weekly for 40 minutes each time. And there you see a little picture of all the participants sitting around the instructor here. And for the subsequent 6 months, it was done once a month. Okay, so our concern, I think we can go on to the next slide, Lina. All right, so here are the findings from the neurocognitive test results. We did extensive investigations into memory. We looked into attention, concentration, visual spatial skills. So all of these form our cognition. And what we showed at 3 months, and here it is highlighted in red for you on this slide, was that there was positive improvements, all right, in memory, in areas of attention, concentration, visual spatial skills, as well as in areas such as verbal fluency as well. All right, so significant improvement. And then when we looked at 9 months, there was still an improvement in some of these, not all, but there was a persistence in improvement noted in memory tasks, in digit span, as well as in visual spatial skills. All right, so I'll explain later on why we didn't see improvements in all the areas. But the most important thing is that with weekly practice at 3 months already, we could see the improvement. Next slide. So now coming to the various biological markers that we looked at. So we collected samples of blood, we collected saliva, we collected urine, as well as also stool, to look at substances in all these different compounds to see if there was any change with mindfulness practice. Now, telomere length. Now, let's go to the next slide, Lina, and then we'll come back. So what are telomeres? Now, this is a very magnified picture of a chromosome in our cells, all right? Magnified many times. Now, at the tip of each chromosome, and here it is marked out in red, are what are known as telomeres. These are the caps on the ends of the chromosome, and they play a very important role. They protect the chromosome from unraveling and breaking up. Okay, so important role for these telomeres. Unfortunately for us is as we age, and sometimes also when we have chronic medical problems like diabetes, hypertension, the length of these telomeres can actually shorten. And of course, when that happens, it puts the whole chromosome at risk. So as these telomeres shorten, they no longer protect the chromosome, and the chromosome can unravel. And of course, when the chromosomes unravel, that leads to the death of the cell. And as you can imagine, as more and more cells die off, there's extensive damage, and particularly in the brain, that can affect our cognition. So telomeres exceedingly important. And what we showed actually, can we go back to the previous slide? Previous slide, yeah. And actually what we showed, no, this one is fine. When we actually looked at the telomere lengths at baseline, and then we looked at it after 3 months, there was actually a significant increase in the telomere length. So that's very good news. Instead of just continuing to reduce and putting the chromosome at risk, the telomeres were actually lengthening, of course, small amounts, but still lengthening, and it was a significant increase with mindfulness practice. All right, so that's important information for us. The other things that we looked at was we looked at biological markers of inflammation. We looked at C-reactive proteins. We looked at interleukin levels. Now, all of this, if there are high levels of this in our blood, it indicates that inflammation is going on. And why are we worried about inflammation? A lot of inflammation in the body, particularly in the brain, can damage the brain. All right, so cognitive impairment can arise because of neuroinflammation. If there's also a lot of inflammation, you can have plaque formation in the brain. And again, that damages our thought process, our thinking, our memory, and so on. Now, also excessive inflammation damages arteries. And if there's arterial damage in the brain, again, affects blood flow to the brain and cognition affected. And of course, more and more of these inflammation just will damage not only the brain, but other parts of the body. So we looked at inflammatory markers in the blood. We looked at markers in the urine. And we looked also at markers of stress as well as neuroplasticity. And all of which I'm quite happy to say is that there were improvements in the levels in the sense that there was evidence that these inflammatory markers actually reduced with mindfulness practice. Now, stress markers, we did cortisol and DHEAS levels. I'm not going to go into details of this, but basically what we showed was these levels also were reduced, indicating that mindfulness helped in reducing the stress. The other thing that we looked at was a biomarker of neuroplasticity. Now, what is neuroplasticity? This means the ability of the brain actually to adapt and change. And what we found is the blood biomarkers of neuroplasticity also improved with mindfulness practice, meaning that there was increased possibility of the brain to adapt to the environment, to changes, and of course make new connections, which is what Dr. Pham will be telling you about when he reviews the scans with you. Okay, next slide. Now, coming to my final biomarker that we looked at, these were the bacteria in our gut. Now, this is very important because there is evidence that when there are changes in gut bacteria, they contribute to inflammation, and these inflammatory substances can go to the brain, damage the brain, and result in cognitive decline. All right, so very important. Now the question is, can changes in the brain that we talked about, the reduction in the biomarkers, the changes in the brain that we saw on the scan, can this also change the gut bacteria? Now, just as a side to you before I present that information, prior to doing this study on mindfulness practice, we actually found that by looking at gut bacteria, we could identify who was aging normally as compared to who already had evidence of cognitive decline in the brain. And this chart actually shows that. Now here on this side, you see these orange triangles. These are people who are aging normally. This is the type of gut bacteria that they have. And it was distinctly different from those who have dementia, which is the red squares, as well as those who have mild cognitive impairment, which is the round blue circles. All right. So it's possible by examining the bacteria in the gut to actually distinguish people who are aging normally from those who already have cognitive impairment. So with this in mind, then we went on the next slide to look at the bacteria. Lina, the next slide, please. To look at the bacteria in the gut and whether with mindfulness practice we could actually change it. Now, if you know anything about gut bacteria, we actually have something like 10 trillion in numbers in our gut bacteria. That's how many bacteria we have. But the common ones are bacteroidetes and firmicutes. So these are the two commonest ones. But there's also this one called proteobacteria in small amounts in our gut. Unfortunately, proteobacteria is what we would refer to as a negative bacteria. It's not good. If I name you some of the bacteria that belongs to this group, you will begin to understand why they are not some things that we want. Examples of proteobacteria are E. coli, are Salmonella, are Vibrio cholera. So you can imagine if you had a lot of this kind of bacteria, you're going to get infections, and that can increase your inflammatory markers and substances in your body that puts you at risk of cognitive damage. All right. So we looked at these bacteria and we looked at them at baseline and after 3 months of mindfulness practice. So some improvement in the good bacteria, the bacteroidetes and the firmicutes, you can actually see slight increases. But what was more significant is the reduction in the negative bacteria. You see the proteobacteria, a significant reduction. That's why it's in red here on your slide. Right? So by practicing mindfulness, even that helps change the bacteria in your gut. So there you are. I've presented this. I think that's my last slide. Lina, do I have anything more? All right. So just a summary then from these brief findings. By doing mindfulness regularly, even just with weekly practice in 3 months, we managed to find that there can be significant improvements in cognition, and there can be changes in your biological markers. And this we managed to show not in those who are aging normally, because we do know it helps them, but importantly, it can be shown in people who already have some mild cognitive impairment. Now, the important thing is regular practice is important if you want to sustain the effects and the benefits that you see. And the reason I put this is, you remember earlier on, when I showed the slide on the neurocognitive test, I said that there were significant improvements at 3 months, but not so much of improvement was sustained at 9 months. And you remember I started off by saying that the intervention was weekly for the first 3 months, but then we reduced the intensity of the intervention to just monthly. So in a way, that explains that without regular practice, you cannot sustain whatever improvements that are seen. So important message again, regular practice of mindfulness will ensure that effects are sustained and the changes will be brought about. And so I'll end there. Thank you.